The shrill sound of the telephone cut through the absolute silence of the early morning like a blade slicing through silk, making Steph Curry instantly awaken from deep sleep. It was exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes in the morning when Steph fumbled in the dark until he found the device on the nightstand, his eyes still heavy with sleep, struggling to focus on the unknown number that blinked on the screen. For a moment, he hesitated. Who would call at this hour of the early morning? But something in the insistence of that ring compelled him to answer. "Hello?" Steph murmured, his voice hoarse from sleep. From the other side of the line, a silence heavy with emotion lasted a few seconds before a familiar voice, but completely transformed by vulnerability, emerged through the device. "Steph, it's me, Michael. Can you perceive that there are moments in life that mark us forever by the simple tone of voice of someone we admire, especially when that voice carries a pain we never imagined existed?" Steph sat up immediately in bed, completely awake now. The voice was unmistakably Michael Jordan's, but there was something different in it. A fragility, a raw vulnerability that Steph had never heard in decades of interviews, documentaries, and public appearances by the basketball legend. "Michael, is everything all right?" Steph asked, feeling his heart accelerate. It was possible to clearly hear that Michael was crying, not just emotional, but genuinely sobbing from the other side of the line. I need to talk to someone," Michael whispered, his voice choked in a way that made Steph feel as if he were witnessing something sacred and private. "And you're the only person in the world that I think can understand." To completely understand what led Michael Jeffrey Jordan, the man considered by many as the greatest athlete of all time, the legend who had become synonymous with invincibility and perfection, to make this desperate call in the middle of the early breeze. Morning? We need to go back exactly 6 months in time to a moment that would forever change his perspective on life, legacy, and what truly matters. It was a sunny October morning in Chicago, and Michael Jordan was in his office on the 33rd floor of a skyscraper in the city center, surrounded by trophies that told the story of a career that redefined the limits of what was possible in sports. The aroma of premium coffee that his assistant Michelle Carter had prepared mixed with the smell of leather from the elegant furniture, creating an atmosphere that breathed success and power. At 61 years old, Michael had built an empire that extended far beyond basketball courts. His Jordan brand continued dominating the global market. His investments in sports teams generated millions, and his name remained synonymous with excellence in practically every corner of the planet. It was, by all external standards, the perfect example of how to transform athletic talent into eternal legacy. But behind the impeccable facade of success, Michael carried a weight that few could understand. The burden of being a living legend, of having become more symbol than person, more myth than man. What is most impressive is how extreme success can become a golden prison, where the perfection expected by millions can suffocate the humanity of whoever is placed on that pedestal. On that specific morning, Michael was watching highlights of a recent Golden State Warriors game on his computer, observing Steph Curry with attention that went beyond simple technical analysis. There was something in the way Steph played, in the genuine joy he radiated on court, in the ease with which he connected with teammates and fans, that touched a part of Michael that he had buried decades ago under layers of fierce competitiveness and relentless perfectionism. "He plays with a freedom that I never allowed myself to have," Michael murmured to himself, pausing the video at a moment where Steph smiled openly after a spectacular shot. It was a pure smile, without calculation, without the constant tension that Michael carried even in his moments of greatest triumph. Jennifer Walsh, his wife, had noticed lately how Michael became more contemplative when watching Steph's games. "You admire something in him that goes beyond basketball, don't you?" she had asked a few weeks before, during an intimate dinner at home. Michael had taken long seconds to respond, absent-mindedly playing with his food while processing feelings he rarely allowed to come to the surface. "He managed to become great without losing himself in the process," he finally replied. "Look at him. He's clearly competitive, wants to win more than anything, but still manages to be human, accessible, real. How is it possible that someone who conquered everything there is to conquer still feels they lost something fundamental along the way?" The comparison wasn't new for Michael. For years, he had observed the DVE new generation of athletes with a mixture of respect and, if he were honest with himself, a hint of envy. Not envy of their successes or abilities, but of the apparent ease with which they navigated fame, while maintaining genuine connections with people around them. Michael remembered his own career, the 6 championships, the individual awards, the moments that defined an entire era of basketball. But he also remembered the price he had paid. Relationships sacrificed at the altar of excellence, friendships lost due to competitiveness he couldn't turn off. Family moments missed chasing a perfection he now realized was an illusion. "True greatness is not never falling," he had said once in an interview years ago. "It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching." But now, alone in his office observing Steph Curry play with childlike joy, Michael wondered if he himself had forgotten how to get up in a way that preserved his humanity. His reflection was interrupted by the ring of the internal telephone. "Mr. Jordan," Michelle Carter's voice sounded through the intercom, "Dr. Robert Kim has arrived for your appointment." Michael felt his stomach contract instantly. The medical appointment he had postponed for months had finally arrived, and no matter how much he tried to maintain his usual composure, he couldn't ignore the anxiety that grew like a distant storm on the horizon. Dr. Robert Kim was one of Chicago's most respected cardiologists, a man of few words whom Michael had sought after weeks of symptoms he preferred to ignore. Chest pains during exercise, shortness of breath at unexpected moments, a fatigue he couldn't simply attribute to aging. "Michael," Dr. Kim said upon entering the office, his expression serious but not alarming, "thank you for finally finding time for this appointment. I know how busy your schedule is. Can you perceive that sometimes we postpone important conversations because a part of us already knows they will change everything, and we're not ready to face that change?" During the appointment, which lasted almost an hour, Dr. Kim was meticulous in his examinations and questions. Michael tried to maintain his usual confident posture, but inside, he felt a growing vulnerability he hadn't experienced in decades. "I'll be direct with you, Michael," Dr. Kim finally said, putting away his medical instruments. "The symptoms you described, combined with what I observed today, indicate that we need to do some more specific tests. Nothing that suggests immediate panic, but definitely something that requires serious attention." The words hung in the air conditioning of the office like thick smoke. Michael, who had faced unimaginable pressures in championship finals, who had looked into the eyes of opponents determined to destroy him and had found strength to win, felt for the first time in decades something he couldn't control or overcome through pure willpower. "What kind of tests?" Michael Feidenfreunde asked, his voice betraying the first crack in the armor of invincibility he had built over a lifetime. "Mainly cardiovascular," Dr. Kim replied gently. "We want to rule out any more serious heart problems. Men your age, especially with the history of physical and emotional stress that elite athletes face, need to be carefully monitored. It's impossible not to feel the overwhelming impact when we realize that our body, which has always been our most reliable tool, may be starting to fail us in ways we cannot control. After Dr. Kim left, Michael remained alone in his office for hours, looking through the window at the city that had witnessed his greatest triumphs. For the first time in decades, he felt genuinely scared, not of opponents or challenges he could face head-on, but of the possibility that his time was becoming finite in a much more real way than he had considered before. It was that afternoon, while observing the movement of the city below and processing the reality of his own mortality, that Michael began to question whether he had lived his life the right way. All the victories, all the records, all the wealth, would they mean anything if he departed, leaving behind only distant admiration instead of genuine connections? Naturally, this leads us to the moment when a legend began to confront not only his physical mortality, but his emotional mortality, realizing that he had built a legacy of greatness, but questioning whether he had built a legacy of humanity. True greatness is not never falling. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching. And for the first time in his life, Michael Jordan was about to discover what it truly meant to get up when he felt more vulnerable than he had ever imagined possible. The following weeks would test not only his physical health, but his ability to find strength in places he had avoided exploring for decades, places where trophies don't matter, where records are irrelevant, and where the only thing that truly counts is the courage to be human in a world that expects legends to be perfect. The manila envelope landed on Michael Jordan's mahogany desk with a dull sound that echoed through the tense silence of his office like a hammer striking a final verdict. 3 weeks had passed since the appointment with Dr. Robert Kim. 3 weeks of tests, MRIs, electrocardiograms, and a growing anxiety that Michael had never experienced, even in the most pressuring moments of his athletic career. He had faced unimaginable pressures in championship finals, but this was different. This was something he couldn't overcome through training, determination, or pure willpower. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, a tremor almost imperceptible that would have surprised anyone who knew Michael Jordan only through his public image of absolute control. The familiar aroma of coffee that Michelle Carter had prepared seemed more bitter that morning, mixing with the smell of medical paper and the light fragrance of perfume that Jennifer had left in the air when she kissed him before leaving for her appointments. Can you perceive that moments like these reveal how fragile our illusion of control over our own lives is, especially when we always believed ourselves to be invincible? The medical report was technical, full of terminology that Michael needed to read several times to understand completely. But the conclusion was clear enough to make his heart race, in a way that had nothing to do with physical exercise. Evidence of coronary artery disease in early stage, immediate lifestyle changes, preventive medication, and regular cardiac monitoring are recommended. Michael let the paper slip from his hands, falling back onto the desk while he leaned back in his executive chair, looking through the panoramic window at the city of Chicago, spreading infinitely in all directions. For the first time in decades, he felt small, not physically, but existentially, as if all his constructed greatness were just a mirage that was beginning to dissipate. Coronary artery disease, he repeated in a low voice, savoring the bitter words as if it were the first time he heard them. His own body, which had been his most reliable tool throughout his life, which had executed impossible movements and endured unimaginable pressures, was beginning to fail in ways he couldn't command or correct. What is most impressive is how the reality of mortality can instantly transform our perspective on everything we thought was important. That afternoon, instead of diving into business meetings or investment analyses as he would normally do, Michael found himself doing something he rarely allowed himself: watching complete games of Steph Curry, not as an analyst or investor, but as someone desperately trying to understand a mystery that tormented him. On his computer screen, Steph was in a press conference after an important victory, and there was something in the ease with which he smiled, in the genuineness of his responses, in the way he spoke about his teammates as true family, that made Michael feel a pang of something he rarely experienced: envy. Not envy of Steph's successes. Michael had conquered more championships, more individual awards, more historical recognition. It was envy of something much deeper and more elusive: Steph's apparent ability to be great without losing himself in the process, to maintain genuine connections, in a world that constantly tries to isolate the exceptional. "When I look at my teammates," Steph was saying on the screen, his eyes shining with unrehearsed sincerity, "I see brothers. I see people I choose to love unconditionally, whom I support on and off the court. Basketball is just the vehicle. What really matters are the relationships we build." How is it possible that someone navigates the world of athletic greatness, maintaining this perspective, when everything around conspires to transform us into solitary gods? Michael paused the video and stood up, walking to the wall where his achievements were meticulously organized. 6 NBA championship trophies, 5 MVP awards, Olympic gold medals, certificates of records that would probably never be broken. It was a wall that told the story of a career that redefined the limits of what was possible in sports. But while observing those symbols of his greatness, Michael didn't feel the usual pride. Instead, he felt something that surprised him: a sense of emptiness, as if all those trophies were just beautiful objects that couldn't fill a hole that had grown in his soul over the decades. Jennifer Walsh found him in this position when she arrived home that night, standing in front of the trophy wall, holding the medical report in one hand and an untouched glass of whiskey in the other, lost in thoughts that seemed to be consuming him from within. "Michael?" she called softly, immediately recognizing that something fundamental had changed since the morning. "Did the results arrive?" He turned slowly, and Jennifer saw in his eyes something that scared her. It wasn't just concern about health, but a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen in years, perhaps decades. It was as if all the defenses he had built over a lifetime were beginning to crumble. "My heart is failing, Jen," he said simply, his voice carrying a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. "Not dramatically, not yet, but it's failing. And I'm here thinking, what did all these years of pursuing perfection serve for if in the end I'll leave behind only trophies and records?" It's impossible not to feel your heart break when we witness someone who always seemed invincible confronting their own humanity for the first time. Jennifer approached and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing lines that had deepened in recent years without her noticing. "You'll leave much more than trophies, love. You inspired millions of people, changed the way the world sees sports." "But how many people did I really touch?" Michael interrupted, his voice choked with emotion he rarely allowed to surface. "How many lives did I impact in a real, personal, human way? Or was I just a winning machine that people admired from a distance?" The question hung in the air between them, like a confession of something Michael had been avoiding confronting for decades. He had become so obsessed with being perfect, with never showing weakness, with maintaining the mask of invincibility, that he had forgotten how to be simply human. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He spent hours browsing the internet, watching his old interviews and comparing them with recent interviews of Steph Curry. The contrast was striking. Where Michael had always been calculated, controlled, careful never to reveal vulnerability, Steph was spontaneous, authentic, willing to admit failures and uncertainties with a courage that Michael now realized was a form of strength he had never developed. Can you perceive that sometimes we need to confront our own mortality to finally understand what it means to be truly alive? During the following weeks, Michael's obsession with Steph Curry intensified. He studied not only his game, but his body language, his interactions with teammates, the ease with which he connected with fans, the genuineness of his relationships. It was as if Steph were a living manual of how to be great without sacrificing humanity in the process. Tyler Brooks, a sports journalist who had covered both athletes extensively, had recently written an article that Michael read dozens of times. Steph Curry redefined greatness in sports not only through his technical skills, but through his ability to maintain genuine humility and authentic connections in a world that constantly tries to dehumanize its heroes. The word dehumanize hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. That was exactly what had happened to him over the years. He had become less human and more symbol, less person and more brand, less Michael and more Jordan. One afternoon, while watching Steph interact with children at a charity event, Michael saw something that made him question his entire approach to life. Steph was genuinely present in every moment, laughing with sincerity, really listening to what the children said, creating memories that clearly meant as much to him as they did to them. Michael remembered his own charity events. Always well organized, always professionally photographed, always executed with the precision of military operations. But how many times had he been genuinely present? How many times had he allowed those moments to touch him back? "True greatness is not never falling," he murmured to himself, repeating the phrase that had become his mantra over the years. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching. But now, observing Steph, Michael was beginning to understand that perhaps there was a third part to that equation he had missed. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching, and to remain human while everyone is watching. How is it possible that it takes us a lifetime to discover that true courage is not in being invincible, but in being vulnerable enough to allow genuine connections? It was during one of those sleepless nights, approximately 5 months after receiving the diagnosis that had changed his perspective on everything, that Michael faced a crisis that would lead him to the point of total rupture. Jennifer was traveling to a conference. The house was empty except for his solitary presence, and the reality of his mortality weighed on him like a mountain. He had spent his entire life building walls around his emotions, being strong for everyone around him, never showing weakness or need. But that early morning, alone with his fears and regrets, Michael Jordan, the legend, the myth, the icon, finally reached the point where he could no longer carry the weight of being invincible. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when even legends reach the limit of their emotional resistance, when the need for genuine human connection becomes more important than preserving a perfect public image. It was 2:15 in the morning when Michael, with hands trembling not from illness, but from pure vulnerability, picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized but never used. Steph Curry's personal number, which he had obtained through mutual contacts months ago. True greatness is not never falling. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching. and to remain human while everyone is observing. And sometimes, the most courageous thing we can do is admit that we need help, even when the entire world expects us to be invincible. The silence of the early morning in Chicago was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the clock on the wall and the labored breathing of Michael Jordan, who paced back and forth in his living room like a caged animal, holding the phone as if it were an anchor in the midst of an emotional storm. It was 2:12 in the morning on a cold Tuesday in March, and Michael had spent the last 4 hours awake, fighting against an anxiety attack that had begun as a vague discomfort and grown to become an overwhelming sensation that he was drowning in his own emotions. The house was shrouded in a darkness that seemed to perfectly reflect the state of his soul. Jennifer was in New York for a medical conference, leaving Michael alone with thoughts he normally managed to suppress through work, exercise, or simply willpower. But that early morning, after weeks of growing insomnia and a loneliness that seemed to be consuming him from within, all his usual defenses had failed. Can you perceive that there is a point where even the strongest people reach the absolute limit of their emotional resistance, where the need for human connection becomes more important than preserving public image? The panic attack had begun around midnight, when Michael was trying to sleep, and his mind started racing with thoughts about mortality, regrets, and a growing sensation that he had wasted decades of his life pursuing a version of greatness that had left him fundamentally empty inside. He had tried all his usual control strategies, breathing exercises, walking around the house, even attempting meditation he had learned years ago, but nothing worked. The sensation that he was losing control of everything, his health, his legacy, his own sense of identity, grew like a wave that threatened to drown him completely. It was when, in a moment of desperation he had never experienced, Michael thought of Steph Curry, not as an athlete to be analyzed or an investment to be considered, but as the only person in the world who could understand the specific weight of carrying impossible expectations while trying to maintain some vestige of humanity. What is most impressive is how, in our moments of greatest vulnerability, we instinctively seek someone we believe can understand our pain without judgment. Michael had obtained Steph's personal number through Robert Kim, a mutual friend who had casually mentioned that the two players had much in common beyond basketball. At the time, Michael had stored the number without specific intentions, but now, with trembling hands and racing heart, he felt that Steph was his only hope of finding some kind of emotional anchor. "He's going to think I'm crazy," Michael murmured to himself, looking at the phone as if it were an instrument of torture. Calling in the middle of the early morning, crying like a child. But the alternative, continuing alone with that pain that seemed to be tearing him apart from within, was unbearable. For the first time in decades, Michael Jordan was facing something he couldn't win through competitiveness, determination, or pure willpower. He was facing his own humanity, and it was winning. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, Michael dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. With each ring, Michael felt his heart accelerate more, part of him hoping Steph wouldn't answer so he could return to his prison of silent suffering. But another part, the part that was desperate for connection, prayed for someone, anyone, to answer and prevent him from drowning completely. "Hello?" Steph's voice sounded hoarse from sleep, but present, real, human, in a way that made Michael feel less alone for the first time in weeks. How is it possible that a single word, spoken by a familiar voice, has the power to bring us back from the abyss of absolute despair? "Steph." Michael tried to speak, but his voice failed. The tears he had been holding back for hours, perhaps for years, finally began to stream down his face, carrying with them decades of repressed pain. "It's me, Michael." From the other side of the line, Steph became completely alert immediately, even through sleep. He recognized something in Michael's voice that made him instantly forget any irritation about being awakened in the middle of the early morning. "Michael? Man, is everything all right? It's 2 in the morning." I... Michael tried to form words, but all that came out were sobs he couldn't control. "I need to talk to someone, and you're the only person in the world that I think can understand." Steph sat up in bed, completely awake now, feeling the weight of vulnerability in the voice of someone he had admired from a distance for years as a symbol of invincible strength. "Michael, what's happening? Where are you?" "I'm at home, in Chicago," Michael managed to say between sobs. "Jennifer is traveling, and I can't pretend I'm okay anymore. I can't carry this alone anymore." It's impossible not to feel your heart break when we witness the exact moment when someone who always seemed indestructible finally allows their humanity to surface. "Carry what, Michael? Tell me what's happening," Steph said gently, his voice carrying genuine compassion that made Michael realize he had made the right choice in calling. And then, like a dam that finally breaks after decades of pressure, Michael began to speak. Not the public Michael Jordan, calculated and controlled, but the human Michael, broken and desperately needy for connection. "I'm dying, Steph," he began, his voice choked with raw emotion. "Not dramatically, not yet, but my heart is failing, and I'm here realizing that I'm going to die and leave behind what? Trophies? Records? A commercial brand?" Steph felt tears forming in his own eyes upon hearing that devastating confession. "Michael?" "No, let me finish," Michael interrupted, as if fearing that if he stopped talking he would lose the courage to continue. "I spent my entire life watching you play, observing how you interact with people, how you maintain genuine relationships, how you manage to be great without losing yourself in the process. And I realized that I'm a failure." The word failure coming from Michael Jordan sounded so impossible that Steph took several seconds to process that he had heard correctly. "Michael, you're not a failure. You're literally considered the greatest of all time." "In basketball," Michael exploded, his voice loaded with decades of repressed frustration. "I'm the GOAT in basketball, but I'm a failure as a human being. Do you know how many people really care about me? How many genuine friendships I have? How many times throughout my career I chose to compete instead of connect? Can you perceive that sometimes the most shocking confessions come from recognizing that we conquered everything we wanted, but lost everything that really matters in the process?" Steph was sitting on the edge of his bed now, completely absorbed in the most intimate and vulnerable conversation he had ever had with another athlete. "Michael, it's not too late to—" "You don't understand," Michael interrupted again, his voice oscillating between despair and anger directed at himself. "I turned everyone around me into enemies to win. Teammates, opponents, even people who tried to get close. I treated them like obstacles or tools for my success." The words now came out like a confession in a confessional, decades of guilt and regret being poured out through a telephone call in the middle of the early morning. "I watch you with your teammates," Michael continued, "the way you celebrate them, how you genuinely care about them as people, not just as pieces in your winning machine. I never learned to do that. I never learned to love the people around me without conditions. How is it possible that an early morning phone call becomes the moment when a legend confronts the most painful truth about himself?" And now, Michael whispered, his voice breaking completely. Now that my time is becoming limited, I realize that I built a legacy of greatness, but not a legacy of love. People admire me, respect me, fear me, but how many love me? How many will miss me as a person, not as a symbol? The silence that followed was deep and loaded with emotion. Steph was crying too now, not only for the pain he heard in Michael's voice, but for the extraordinary courage that was being necessary to make that confession. "Michael," Steph finally said, his own voice choked, "thank you for trusting me with this. Thank you for showing me that even you struggle with these questions. It makes me feel less alone with my own insecurities." "Your insecurities?" Michael asked, genuinely surprised. "Man, do you think it's easy to carry expectations the way you carried them? Do you think I don't question myself every day whether I'm making the right choices? Whether I'm being the man my family needs me to be? The difference is that I had you as an example of what I don't want to become." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when two legends of the sport discover that their shared greatness created a bridge of understanding that neither of them expected to find. "Example of what you don't want to become?" Michael repeated, processing those words. "Michael, you taught me that it's possible to be too great to be happy. Observing your career made me realize that I needed to find ways to win without sacrificing my humanity in the process. In a very real sense, your struggles saved me from making the same mistakes. It was the most shocking revelation of all, that Michael Jordan, in his vulnerability and pain, had inadvertently become a teacher for the next generation about how to balance greatness with humanity." "Michael," Steph continued, his voice now carrying deep wisdom, "you think you failed because you chose competition over connection. But look what's happening right now. You had the courage to call me, to be vulnerable, to ask for help. That's not failure. That's the most human thing you could do. Can you perceive that sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest gifts to the world?" "But it's too late," Michael whispered. "I'm 61 years old. My heart is failing, and I wasted decades building walls instead of bridges." "It's never too late to start building bridges," Steph replied firmly. "Michael, you just built a bridge to me tonight, and I guarantee that if you have the courage to keep building bridges, you'll discover that there are many people who want to connect with the real Michael, not just the legend." The conversation that had begun at 2:15 in the morning extended until sunrise appeared through the panoramic windows of Michael's apartment in Chicago, painting the sky with golden tones that seemed to symbolize something new being born in their lives. When Steph finally hung up the phone at 5:43 in the morning, both men remained in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. It wasn't just a conversation. It had been an emotional transfusion, a moment of human connection so profound that it had fundamentally changed how both saw themselves and their place in the world. Michael remained seated in his leather armchair, holding the phone as if it were an umbilical cord connecting him to life. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel alone. Not because someone had solved his problems or offered magical solutions, but because someone had truly seen him, not as Michael Jordan, the legend, but as Michael, the man who struggled to find meaning beyond trophies and records. "Can't EBT, you perceive that sometimes the simple act of being truly heard and understood has deeper healing power than any advice or practical solution?" On the other side of the country, Steph was sitting on the balcony of his house in San Francisco, watching the sunrise and reflecting on how an early morning call had completely transformed his understanding of greatness, legacy, and the responsibility that comes with being admired by millions. During the 3 hours and 28 minutes of conversation, something extraordinary had happened. Michael had gradually stopped crying and started talking, really talking, about things he had kept buried for decades. Fears about mortality, regrets about lost relationships, insecurities about his value as a person versus his value as an athlete. And Steph, in turn, had shared his own struggles, the constant pressure to maintain a perfect image, the fear of disappointing people who saw him as inspiration, the difficulty of balancing ambition with genuine humility. What is most impressive is how one person's authentic vulnerability can open space for another person to be equally vulnerable, creating an ascending spiral of genuine connection. "You saved my life tonight," Michael had said during the final minutes of the conversation, his voice now calm but loaded with deep gratitude. "No," Steph had replied. "You saved your own life by having the courage to call. I just listened. But you heard me in a way that no one had heard me in years. You saw me as human when I had forgotten how to be human." In the weeks following that transformative early morning, Michael Jordan began to live differently. Not dramatically, he didn't abandon his businesses or become a completely different person overnight. But subtle and profound changes began to emerge. Jennifer Walsh noticed immediately when she returned from her trip. "Something changed in you," she said on the first morning back, observing how Michael seemed more present during breakfast, more genuinely interested in how her conference had been, less distracted by the electronic devices that normally dominated his attention. "I had a conversation," Michael replied simply. "A conversation that reminded me of who I was before I became who everyone expected me to be." How is it possible that a single conversation has the power to reconnect us with parts of ourselves we had lost decades ago? Michael began making phone calls, not for business or professional commitments, but to people. Former teammates with whom he had lost contact, childhood friends who had been left behind in the race for greatness, even some old adversaries with whom he would like to make peace. The first call was to Scottie Pippen, with whom he had had a complicated relationship in recent years due to differences about how their mutual contributions were remembered by history. The conversation was hesitant at first, but when Michael genuinely apologized for moments when his competitiveness had hurt his feelings, something began to heal between them. "I never heard you talk like this before," Scottie said during that conversation. "It's like you finally found a way to be strong without needing to make everyone around you feel smaller." Tyler Brooks, the sports journalist who had covered both athletes, noticed the change when he interviewed Michael a few weeks later. "There's something different in your eyes," he commented after the interview. "A softness I had never seen before. It's like you had made peace with something fundamental." Meanwhile, Steph was also being transformed by the experience. The conversation with Michael had given him a unique perspective on the weight of greatness and the importance of maintaining genuine connections even at the height of success. It's impossible not to feel admiration when we witness how one person's vulnerability can become a source of strength and wisdom for another. Steph began speaking more openly about pressures and insecurities in his own interviews, using his platform to normalize conversations about mental health and the importance of asking for help when necessary. He never specifically mentioned his conversation with Michael. That remained sacred between them. But the themes he began addressing were clearly influenced by that transformative experience. Sometimes the strongest people are those who have the courage to admit when they need support, Steph said during an interview that went viral. "Real greatness is not about being invincible. It's about being brave enough to be human. 2 months after that early morning in March, Michael and Steph met in person for the first time since the call. It was a charity event in Los Angeles, and when they saw each other through the crowd, there was a moment of recognition that transcended anything they had experienced with other athletes or celebrities. They embraced, not the protocol embrace of two public figures, but the genuine embrace of two men who had shared something deeply intimate and transformative. "How are you?" Steph asked, looking directly into Michael's eyes. "I'm becoming human again," Michael replied, smiling in a way Steph had never seen in decades of highlights and interviews. "Slowly, but I'm getting there." Can you perceive that sometimes the deepest friendships are born not from shared interests, but from shared vulnerabilities? During the event, other athletes and celebrities noticed something special in the interaction between Michael and Steph. There was an authenticity, a genuine connection that contrasted with the more superficial interactions typical of these events. Robert Kim, the doctor who had given the initial diagnosis that catalyzed everything, was present at the event and observed Michael interacting with other people in a completely different way. "It's remarkable," he commented to Jennifer. "It's like he rediscovered how to connect with people without turning every interaction into competition." Michael's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the sports media. Articles began appearing about a new version of Michael Jordan, more accessible, more human, more willing to talk about struggles and vulnerabilities. Initially, some critics suggested it was just a public relations strategy, but the consistency and authenticity of the change soon silenced those voices. Michelle Carter, Michael's longtime assistant, summarized it best. "It's like he finally gave himself permission to be a complete person, not just the part that wins." 6 months after that early morning call, in a deep interview with Tyler Brooks, Michael finally decided to speak publicly about his journey of personal transformation. He didn't specifically mention Steph or the call. Some moments are too sacred to be completely shared, but spoke about the importance of vulnerability, genuine connection, and redefining what it means to be great. "True greatness is not never falling," Michael said, repeating the phrase that had become his mantra over the years. "It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching, to remain human while everyone is observing, and to have enough courage to ask for help when we need it." How is it possible that a phrase we've known for years can gain completely new meaning when lived instead of just spoken? The interview went viral instantly. Not because Michael had revealed scandalous secrets or made controversial statements, but because he had shown a vulnerability and humanity that shocked the world, a world accustomed to seeing Michael Jordan as an invincible symbol, not as a man who struggled with the same insecurities and fears we all face. Millions of people saw themselves in Michael's journey. Men who had sacrificed relationships pursuing success. Women who had lost themselves in their own versions of perfection. Young people who were learning that vulnerability is strength, not weakness. Steph watched the interview from his home, smiling through tears of pride for his friend and gratitude for the role he had played in his transformation. More importantly, he felt grateful for the way Michael had transformed his own understanding of greatness and humanity. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when we understand that some conversations don't just change the people involved, but create waves of transformation that touch millions of lives. 1 year after that March early morning, Michael and Steph established a joint foundation focused on mental health for athletes and people in leadership positions. It wasn't about publicity or tax benefits. It was about using their platforms to normalize conversations about vulnerability and the importance of genuine human connections. "That call saved more than my life," Michael said during the Foundation's launch. It taught me that our greatest strength doesn't come from our ability to be invincible, but from our courage to be real. It's impossible not to feel hope when we realize that even our deepest crises can become bridges to a more authentic and connected life. The story of that early morning call eventually became legend in the sports world. Not for the specific details, which remained private, but for what it represented. Two legends discovering that true greatness includes the courage to be vulnerable, to ask for help, and to allow others to see us as we really are. True greatness is not never falling. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching, to remain human while everyone is observing, to be vulnerable enough for genuine connections, and to transform our wounds into wisdom that can heal others. And sometimes, the most courageous thing we can do is pick up the phone in the middle of the early morning and admit that, behind all the trophies and records, we are just human beings needing other human beings. This is a story about a telephone call, but it's mainly a story about the transformative power of authentic vulnerability and how true greatness always includes the courage to be completely human.